Hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are reading The Last Stand by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. But first, reading updates. I've only read the first story of Stray, and I'm excited. I'm enjoying it so far. I mean, Emma Donoghue, I just really enjoy her writing. I've read 3 of her novels. I've read The Room, I've read The Wonder, and Frog Music, and I just really enjoy them. And when I saw that she had a bunch that I just haven't seen, I picked this one up, and it's just a bunch of like short stories that are all based on factual things. So, for instance, the first one is about this elephant handler, and he's trying to get the elephant Jumbo onto this ship. Jumbo has just been sold from London, and they're trying to get him all the way to the US because Barnum has purchased him. And so it's a lot of like internal monologue, which is really cool. And it's just it's just really good. Like, who knew that I could care so much about this handler and this elephant? And then at the end of it, it has like what the story, like how this story came about. So it says like this story is based on almost daily reports in the Times of London between January and April 1882, as well as Superintendent Abraham Bartlett's hostile account in His Wild Animals in Captivity from 1898, and the ghost-written 1885 autobiography of Matthew Scott, Jumbo's Keeper. So that's kind of cool that like each of them is based on like actual things, and The Wonder is like that too. That whole book is based on articles that Emma Donoghue like dove into, which is really nice. But something that is also interesting is that the stories are broken up into different sections. So it is departures. Let me see what they are. I can't flip this page. It's departures, in transit, and then arrivals and aftermaths. So right now I'm still in the departures stage, but I am enjoying it. Oh, I totally lied. I read the second one as well. And that one was based on fun. It's actually really cool. Carolyn Thompson's existence is recorded only in the letters of Charles Dickens. The young draftsman Frederick Maynard first wrote to the novelist about his older sister on October 10th, 1854, and Dickens got to know both siblings before persuading his fellow philanthropist Angela Burdett Coutts to set Carolyn up with a lodging house. So that's pretty cool. Also, I didn't read the whole like about thing, but just to give the gist, it's pretty exciting. So yeah, I am enjoying this. And again, I've only read the first two, but I like it. And I just really like Emma Donoghue's writing. And of course, I'm still reading Light of the Jedi. I will be continuing it. I am, oopsie, more than 50% of the way through, so for visual folk, I have this much to read and I've read this much. I'm liking it. I just really like Star Wars, and I love any time that the Star Wars world is more fleshed out. So, it's like candy. Well, that's a bad example because I'm not like a huge candy person. It's like taro milk tea. I will always have it. Ugh. If the option is available, I will always get taro milk tea because it's delicious and amazing. And you throw in some boba in there, and I didn't used to be a boba person, but here we are, drinking boba. I think that's all that I'm reading. Yeah. Yep. Okay. But today we are reading The Last Bow. It's more Sherlock stuff. And the way that this one is structured, so I thought that there was another novel in this book, and there is, but it's The Hounds of Baskerville, which I've already read. And so we are going to read this one, and the way it's set up is Watson has written down like little smaller cases and put it this way. So it's like a bunch of smaller cases. Not necessarily that the cases themselves are smaller, but just like it's in short form more than novel form. Let's do it. Let's do it. So, his last bow. I think I said the last bow earlier. It's definitely called his last bow. Oopsie. Oopsie, oopsie. Okay. Preface. His last bow. The friends of Mr. Sherlock Holmes will be glad to learn that he is still alive and well, though somewhat crippled by occasional attacks of rheumatism. He has, for many years, lived in a small farm upon the Downs 5 miles from Eastbourne, where his time is divided between philosophy and agriculture. During this period of rest, he has refused the most princely offers to take up various cases, having determined that his retirement was a permanent one. The approach of the German war caused him, however, to lay his remarkable combination of intellectual and practical activity at the disposal of the government, with historical results which are recounted in his last bow. Several previous experiences, which have lain long in my portfolio, have been added to his last bow so as to complete the volume. Signed, John H. Watson, M.D. So now we're getting into our first one. The Adventure of Wisteria Lane. Part 1. The Singular Experience of Mr. John Scott Eccles. And I really don't know if that's how you pronounce his name, but it is spelled Eccles. I find it recorded in my notebook that it was a bleak and windy day towards the end of March in the year of 1892. Holmes had received a telegram while we sat at our lunch, and he had scribbled a reply. He made no remark, but the matter remained in his thoughts, for he stood in front of the fire afterwards with a Garcia's skipped a page. Hold on a second. Afterwards, with a thoughtful face, smoking his pipe and casting an occasional glance at the message. Suddenly, he turned upon me with a mischievous twinkle in his eye. "I suppose, Watson, we must look upon you as a man of letters," said he. "How do you find the word grotesque?" "Strange. Remarkable," I suggested. He shook his head at my definition. "There is surely something more than that," said he. "Some underlying suggestion of the tragic and the terrible. If you cast your mind back to some of those narratives with which you have afflicted a long-suffering public, you will recognize how often the grotesque has deepened into the criminal. Think of that little affair of the red-headed man. That was grotesque enough in the outset, and yet it ended in a desperate attempt at robbery. Or, again, there was that most grotesque affair of the 5 orange pips, which led straight to a murderous conspiracy. The word puts me on the alert." Have you it there?" I asked. He read the telegram aloud. "Have just had most incredible and grotesque experience. May I consult you? Signed, Scott Eccles, Post Office, Charing Cross." "Man or woman?" I asked. "Oh, man, of course. No woman would ever send a reply-paid telegram. She would have come." "Will you see him?" "My dear Watson, you know how bored I have been since we locked up Colonel Carruthers. My mind is like a racing engine, tearing itself to pieces because it is not connected up with the work for which it was built. Life is commonplace. The papers are sterile. Audacity and romance even seem to have passed forever from the criminal world. Can you ask me, then, whether I am ready to look into any new problem, however trivial it may prove? But there, unless I am mistaken, is our client." A measured step was heard up the stairs, and a moment later a stout, tall, gray-whiskered, and solemnly respectable person was ushered into the room. His life history was written in his heavy features and pompous manner. From his spats to his gold-rimmed spectacles he was a conservative, a churchman, a good citizen, orthodox and conventional to the last degree. But some amazing experience had disturbed his native composure and left its traces in his bristling hair, his flushed, angry cheeks, and his flurried, excited manner. He plunged instantly into his business. "I have had a most singular and unpleasant experience, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Never in my life have I been placed in such a situation. It is most improper, most outrageous. I must insist upon some explanation." He swelled and puffed in his anger. "Pray sit down, Mr. Scott Eccles," said Holmes, in a soothing voice. May I ask, in the first place, why you came to see me at all?" "Well, sir, it did not appear to be a matter which concerned the police, and yet, when you have heard the facts, you must admit that I could not leave it where it was. Private detectives are a class with whom I have absolutely no sympathy, but none the less, having heard your name, quite so. But, in the second place, why did you come at once?" "What do you mean?" Holmes glanced at his watch. "It is 2:15, he said. "Your telegram was dispatched about 1, but no one can glance at your toilet and attire without seeing that your disturbance dates from the moment of your waken." Our client smoothed down his unbrushed hair and felt his unshaven chin. "You are right, Mr. Holmes. I never gave a thought to my toilet. I was only too glad to get out of such a house, but I have been running round making inquiries before I came to you. I went to the house agents, you know, and they said that Mr. Garcia's rent was paid up all right, and that everything was in order at Wisteria Lodge." "Come, come, sir," said Holmes, laughing. "You are like my friend, Dr. Watson, who has a bad habit of telling his stories wrong end foremost. Please, arrange your thoughts, and let me know, in their due sequence, exactly what those events are which have sent you out unbrushed and unkempt, with dress boots and waistcoat buttoned awry, in search of advice and assistance." Our client looked down with a rueful face at his own unconventional appearance. "I'm sure it must look very bad, Mr. Holmes, and I am not aware that in my whole life such a thing has ever happened before. But I will tell you the whole odd business, and when I have done so, you will admit, I am sure, that there has been enough to excuse me." But his narrative was nipped in the bud. There was a bustle outside, and Mrs. Hudson opened the door to usher in 2 robust and official-looking individuals, one of whom was well known to us as Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard, an energetic, gallant, and within his limitations, a capable officer. He shook hands with Holmes and introduced his comrades as Inspector Baines of Surrey Constabulary. "We are hunting together, Mr. Holmes, and our trail lay in this direction." He turned his bulldog eyes upon our visitor. "Are you Mr. John Scott Eccles, of Popham House, Lee?" "I am." "We have been following you about all this morning." "You traced him through the telegram, no doubt," said Holmes. "Exactly, Mr. Holmes. We picked up the scent at Charing Cross post office and came on here." "But why do you follow me? What do you want?" "We wish a statement, Mr. Scott Eccles, as to the events which led up to the death last night of Mr. Oh no, okay, hold on, let's see if I can say this name. Mr. Aloysius Garcia of Wisteria Lodge, near Esher." Our client had sat up with staring eyes, and every tinge of color struck from his astonished face. "Dead," Did you say he was dead?
Yes, sir. He is dead.
But how? In accident?
Murder, if ever there was one upon earth.
Good God, that is awful. You don't mean... You don't mean that I'm suspected?
A letter of yours was found in the dead man's pocket, and we know by it that you had planned to pass last night at his house.
So I did.
Oh, you did you? Out came the official notebook. Wait a bit, Gregson, said Sherlock Holmes. All you desire is a plain statement, is it not? And it is my duty to warn Mr. Scott Eccles that it may be used against him. Mr. Eccles was going to tell us about it when you entered the room. I think, Watson, a brandy and soda would do him no harm. Now, good sir, I suggest that you take no notice of this addition to your audience, and that you proceed with your narrative exactly as you would have done had you never been interrupted. Our visitor had gulped off the brandy, and the color had returned to his face. With a dubious glance at the inspector's notebook, he plunged at once into his extraordinary statement. "I am a bachelor," said he, "and being of a sociable turn, I cultivate a large number of friends. Among these are the family of a retired brewer called Melvin, living in Albemarle. There's R's in places that I feel like there shouldn't be. Oh, totally lied. There's only one R. Albemarle Mansion, Kensington. There we go. It was at his table that I met some weeks ago a young fellow named Garcia. He was, I understood, of Spanish descent, and connected in some ways with the embassy. He spoke perfect English, was pleasing in his manners, and as good-looking a man as ever I saw in my life. In some ways we struck up quite a friendship, this young fellow and I. He seemed to take a fancy to me from the first, and within 2 days of our meeting he came to see me at Lee. One thing led to another, and it ended in his inviting me out to spend a few days at his house, Wisteria Lodge, between Esher and Oxshott. Yesterday evening I went to Esher to fulfill this engagement. He had described his household to me before I went there. He lived with a faithful servant, a countryman of his own, who looked after all his needs. This fellow could speak English and did his housekeeping for him. Then there was a wonderful cook, he said. He had picked him up from his travels, who could serve an excellent dinner. I remember that he remarked what an odd household it was to find in the heart of Surrey, and that I agreed with him, though it was proved a good deal odder than I thought. I drove to the place, about 2 miles on the south side of Esher. The house was a fair-sized one, standing back from the road, with a curving drive which was banked with high evergreen shrubs. It was an old, tumble-down building in a crazy state of disrepair. When the trap pulled up on the grassy-grown drive in front of the blotched and weather-stained door, I had doubts as to my wisdom in visiting a man whom I knew so slightly. He opened the door himself, however, and greeted me with a great show of cordiality. I was handed over to the manservant, a melancholy, swarthy individual, who led the way, my bag in his hand, to my bedroom. The whole place was depressing. Our dinner was tete-a-tete, and though my host did his best to be entertaining, his thoughts seemed to continually wander, and he talked so vaguely and wildly that I could hardly understand him. He continually drummed his fingers on the table, gnawed his nails, and gave other signs of nervous impatience. The dinner itself was neither well served nor well cooked, and the gloomy presence of the taciturn servant did not help to enliven us. I can assure you that many times in the course of the evening I wished that I could invent some excuse which would take me back to Lee. One thing comes back to my memory which may have a bearing upon the business that you two gentlemen are investigating. I thought nothing of it at the time. Near the end of dinner a note was handed in by the servant. I noticed that after my host had read it he seemed even more distrait and strange than before. He gave up all pretense at conversation and sat smoking endless cigarettes, lost in his own thoughts, but he made no remark as to the contents. About 11, I was glad to go to bed. Some time later, Garcia looked in at my door. The room was dark at the time, and asked me if I had rung. I said that I had not. He apologized for disturbing me so late, saying that it was nearly 1 o'clock. I dropped off after this and slept soundly all night. Now I come to the amazing part of my tale. When I woke, it was broad daylight. I glanced at my watch, and the time was nearly 9. I had particularly asked to be called at 8, so I was very much astonished at this forgetfulness. I sprang up and rang for the servant. There was no response. I rang again, and again, with the same result. Then I came to the conclusion that the bell was out of order. I huddled on my clothes and hurried downstairs in an exceedingly bad temper to order some hot water. You can imagine my surprise when I found that there was no one there. I shouted in the hall. There was no answer. Then I ran from room to room. All were deserted. My host had shown me which was his bedroom the night before, so I knocked at the door. No reply. I turned the handle and walked in. The room was empty, and the bed had never been slept in. He had gone with the rest. The foreign host, the foreign footman, the foreign cook, all had vanished in the night. That was the end of my visit at Wisteria Lodge. Sherlock Holmes was rubbing his hands and chuckling as he added this bizarre incident to his collection of strange episodes. Your experience is, so far as I know, perfectly unique, said he. May I ask, sir, what you did then? Well, I was furious. My first idea was that I had been the victim of some absurd practical joke. I packed my things, banged the hall door behind me, and set off for Esher with my bag in my hand. I called at Allen Brothers, the chief land agents in the village, and found that it was from this firm that the villa had been rented. It struck me that the whole proceeding could hardly be for the purpose of making a fool of me, and that the main object must be to get out of the rent. It is late in March, so quarter day is at hand, but this theory would not work. The agent was obliged to me for my warning, but told me that the rent had been paid in advance. Then I made my way to town and called at the Spanish embassy. The man was unknown there. After this I went to see Melvin, at whose house I had first met Garcia, but I found that he really knew rather less about him than I did. Finally, when I got your reply to my wire, I came out to you, since I gather that you are a person who gives advice in difficult cases. But now, Mr. Inspector, I understand from what you said when you entered the room that you can carry the story on, and that some tragedy has occurred. I can assure you that every word I have said is the truth, and that, outside of what I have told you, I know absolutely nothing about the fate of this man. My only desire is to help the law in every way possible. I am sure of it, Mr. Scott Eccles. I am sure of it, said the Inspector Gregson, in a very amiable tone. I am bound to say that everything which you have said agrees very closely with the facts as they have come to our notice. For example, there was that note which arrived during dinner. Did you chance to observe what became of it? Yes, I did. Garcia rolled it up and threw it into the fire. What did you say to that, Mr. Baines? The country detective was a stout, puffy, red man, whose face was only redeemed from grossness by 2 extraordinarily bright eyes, almost hidden behind the heavy creases of cheek and brow. With a slow smile he drew a folded and discolored scrap of paper from his pocket. It was a dog grate, Mr. Holmes, and he overpitched it. I picked this out unburned from the back of it. Holmes smiled his appreciation. You must have examined the house very carefully to find a single pellet of paper. Well, I did, Mr. Holmes. It's my way. Shall I read it, Mr. Gregson? The Londoner nodded. The note is written upon ordinary cream-laid paper without watermark. It is a quarter sheet. The paper is cut off in 2 snips with short-bladed scissors. It has been folded over 3 times and sealed with purple wax, put on hurriedly and pressed down with some flat oval object. It is addressed to Mr. Garcia, Wisteria Lodge. It says, "Our own colors, green and white. Green open, white shut. Main stair, first corridor, 7th right, green bias. Godspeed. D." It is a woman's writing, done with a sharp pointed pen, but the address is neither done with another pen or by someone else. It is thicker and bolder, as you see. "A very remarkable note," said Holmes, glancing it over. "I must compliment you, Mr. Baines, upon your attention to detail in your examination of it. A few trifling points might perhaps be added. The oval seal is undoubtedly a plain sleeve ink. What else is of such a shape? The scissors were bent nail scissors. Short as the 2 snips are, you can distinctly see the same slight curve in each." The country detective chuckled. "I thought I had squeezed all the juice out of it, but I see there is a little over," he said. "I'm bound to say that I make nothing of the note except that there was something on hand, and that a woman, as usual, was at the bottom of it." Mr. Scott Eccles had fidgeted in his seat during this conversation. "I'm glad you found the note, since it corroborates my story," said he. "But I beg to point out that I have not yet heard what has happened to Mr. Garcia, nor what has become of his household." "As to Garcia," said Gregson, "that is easily answered. He was found dead this morning upon Oxshott Common, nearly a mile from his home. His head had been smashed to pulp by heavy blows of a sandbag or of some such instrument, which had crushed rather than wounded. It is a lonely corner, and there is no house within a quarter of a mile of the spot. He had apparently been struck down first from behind, but his assailant had gone on beating him long after he was dead. It was most furious assault. There are no footsteps nor any clue to the criminals." "Robbed?" "No. There was no attempt at robbery." "This is very painful indeed," said Mr. Scott Eccles in a querulous voice. "But it is really uncommonly hard upon me. I had nothing to do with my host going off upon a nocturnal excursion and meeting so sad an end. How do I come to be mixed up in this case?" "Very simply, sir," Inspector Baines answered. "The only document found in the pocket of the deceased was a letter from you saying that you would be with him on the night of his death. It was the envelope of this letter which gave us the dead man's name and address. It was after 9 this morning when we reached his house and found neither you nor anyone else inside it. I wired to Mr. Gregson to run you down in London while I examined Wisteria Lodge. Then I came into town, joined Mr. Gregson, and here we are." "I think now," said Gregson, rising, "you had best put this matter into an official shape. You will come round with us to the station. Oh, Gregson, excuse me, I was using the wrong voice." "I think now," said Gregson, rising, "we had best put this matter into an official shape. You will come round with us to the station, Mr. Scott Eccles, and let us have your statement in writing." "Certainly." "I will come at once, but I retain your services, Mr. Holmes. I desire you to spare no expense and no pains to get at the truth." My friend turned to the country inspector. "I suppose that you have no objection to my collaborating with you, Mr. Baines?" "Highly honored, sir, I am sure." "You appear to have been very prompt and businesslike in all that you have done. Was there any clue may I ask, as to the exact hour that the man met his death?" "He had been there since 1 o'clock. There was rain about that time, and his death had certainly been before the rain." "Hmm. That is perfectly impossible, Mr. Baines," cried our client. "His voice is unmistakable. I could swear to it that it was he who addressed me in my bedroom at that very hour." "Remarkable, but by no means impossible," said Holmes, smiling. "You have a clue?" asked Gregson. "On the face of it, the case is not a very complex one, though it certainly presents some novel and interesting features. A further knowledge of facts is necessary before I would venture to give a final and definite opinion. By the way, Mr. Baines, did you find anything remarkable besides this note in your examination of the house?" The detective looked at my friend in a singular way. "There were," said he, "one or two very remarkable things. Perhaps when I have finished at the police station you would care to come out and give me your opinion of them." "I am entirely at your service," said Sherlock Holmes, ringing the bell. "You will show these gentlemen out, Mrs. Hudson, and kindly send the boy with his telegram. He is to pay a 5-shilling reply." We sat for some time in silence after our visitors had left. Holmes smoked hard, with his brows drawn down over his keen eyes, and his head thrust forward in the eager way characteristic of the man. "Well, Watson," said he, turning suddenly upon me, "what do you make of it?" "I can make nothing of this mystification of Scott Eccles." "But the crime?" "Well, taken with the disappearance of the man's companions, I should say that they were in some way concerned with the murder and had fled from justice." "That is certainly a possible point of view. On the face of it you must admit, however, that it is very strange that his 2 servants should have been in the conspiracy against him, and should have attacked him on the one night when he had a guest. They had him alone at their mercy every other night in the week." "Then why did they fly?" "Quite so. Why did they fly? There is a big fact. Another big fact is the remarkable experience of our client, Scott Eccles. Now, my dear Watson, is it beyond the limits of human ingenuity to furnish an explanation which would cover both these big facts? Is it, if it were one which would also admit of the mysterious note with its very curious phraseology, why, then, it would be worth accepting as a temporary hypothesis. If the fresh facts which come to our knowledge all fit themselves into the scheme, then our hypothesis may gradually become a solution." "But what is our hypothesis?" Holmes leaned back in his chair with half-closed eyes. "You must admit, my dear Watson, that the idea of a joke is impossible. There were grave events afoot, as the sequel showed, and the coaxing of Scott Eccles to Wisteria Lodge had some connection with it." "But what possible connection?" "Let us take it link by link. There is, on the face of it, something unnatural about this strange and sudden friendship between the young Spaniard and Scott Eccles. It was the former who forced the pace. He called upon Eccles at the other end of London on the very day after he first met him, and he kept in close touch with him until he got him down to Esher. Now, what did he want with Eccles? What could Eccles supply? I see no charm in the man. He is not particularly intelligent, not a man likely to be congenial in a quick-witted Latin. To a quick-witted Latin. Yet why, then, was he picked from all the other people whom Garcia met as particularly suitable to his purpose? Has he any one outstanding quality? I say that he has. He is the very type of conventional British respectability, and the very man as a witness to impress another Briton. You saw yourself how neither of the inspectors dreamed of questioning his statement, extraordinary as it was. But what was he to witness? Nothing, as things turned out, but everything, had they gone another way. That is how I read the matter. I see. He might have proved an alibi. Exactly, my dear Watson. He might have proved an alibi. We will suppose, for argument's sake, that the household of Wisteria Lodge are confederates in some design. The attempt, whatever it may be, is to come off, we will say, before 1 o'clock. By some juggling of the clock, it is quite possible that they may have got Scott Eccles to bed earlier than he thought. But in any case, it is likely that when Garcia went out of his way to tell him that it was 1, it was really not more than 12. If Garcia could do whatever he had to do and be back by the hour mentioned, he had evidently a powerful reply to any accusation. Here was this irreproachable Englishman, ready to swear in any court of law that the accused was in his house all the time. It was an insurance against the worst. Yes, I see that. But how about the disappearance of the others? I have not all of my facts yet, but I do not think there are any insuperable difficulties. Still, it is an error to argue in front of your data. You find yourself insensibly twisting them round to fit your theories. And the message? How did it run? Our own colors, green and white. Sounds like racing. Green open, white shut. That is clearly a signal. Main stair, first corridor. 7th right, green baize. This is an assignation. We may find a jealous husband at the bottom of it all. It was clearly a dangerous quest. She would not have said Godspeed had it not been so. D. That should be a guide. Man was a Spaniard. I suggest that D stands for Dolores, a common female name in Spain. Good, Watson. Very good, but quite inadmissible. A Spaniard would write to a Spaniard in Spanish. The writer of this note is certainly English. Well, we can only process our souls in patience until this excellent inspector comes back for us. Meanwhile, we can thank our lucky fate, which has rescued us for a few short hours from the insufferable fatigues of idleness. An answer had arrived to Holmes's telegram before our Surrey officer had returned. Holmes read it, and was about to place it in his notebook when he caught a glimpse of my expectant face. He tossed it across with a laugh. "You are moving in exalted circles," said he. The telegram was a list of names and addresses. Lord Harringby, the Dingle. Sir George Follett, Oxshott Towners. Mr. Hines, J.P., Purdy Place. Mr. James Baker Williams, Forton Old Hall. Mr. Henry, Highgable. Reverend Joshua Stone, Nether Walsing. "This is a very obvious way of limiting our field of operations," said Holmes. "No doubt Baines, with his methodical mind, has already adopted some similar plan." "I don't quite understand." "Well, my dear fellow, we have already arrived at the conclusion that the message received by Garcia at dinner was an appointment or an assignation. Now, if the obvious reading of it is correct, and in order to keep this tryst one has to ascend a main stair and seek the 7th door in the corridor, it is perfectly clear that the house is a very large one. It is equally certain that this house cannot be more than a mile or 2 from Oxshott, since Garcia was walking in that direction and hoped, according to my reading of the facts, to be back in Wisteria Lodge in time to avail himself of an alibi, which would only be valid up to 1 o'clock. As the number of large houses close to Oxshott must be limited, I adopted the obvious method of sending to the agents mentioned by Scott Eccles and obtaining a list of them. Here they are in this telegram, and the other end of our tangled skein must lie among them. It was nearly 6 o'clock before we found ourselves in the pretty Surrey village of Esher, with Inspector Baines as our companion. Holmes and I had taken things for the night, and found comfortable quarters at the Bull. Finally, we set out in the company of the detective on our visit to Wisteria Lodge. It was a cold, dark March evening, with a sharp wind and a fine rain beating upon our faces. A fit setting for the wild common over which our road passed, and the tragic goal to which it led us. And that's the end of part 1. A little sip break. Yes, you gotta hydrate, little bean. Okay, so what has happened so far? Holmes and Watson are bored, but luckily they get a message, and immediately after receiving this message, good old Eccles pops in, out of breath, and he is about to tell his story. Holmes notices that he's super disheveled and that he just like immediately rushed over here pretty close to after he even sent the letter. So something is urgent. So as Eccles is about to explain, 2 inspectors walk in. One from the country and one from London. And they're like, we came here because we knew that Eccles was going to be here. He is suspected of murder. So Holmes is like, all right, cool. Eccles was about to tell his story. Let's just hear it all from him at the same time. So Eccles tells his story, and it is an odd one. He goes to the house of Garcia, and he just met Garcia, so he doesn't know him very well. Garcia is Spanish, and so is his help. I think his help is also Spanish. Anyway, he said that the dinner was weird, not super amazing. The company was also a little odd. So he decided to go to bed around like 11. So he goes to bed and he's woken up at 1 o'clock, as stated by our guest Garcia, asking if Eccles has rung for any assistance. And Eccles is like, no. And Garcia's like, cool, because it's 1 a.m. And then he leaves. Garcia wakes up the next morning. It's 9 o'clock. He's a little frustrated because he asked to be woken up at 8. So he like rings the bell. Nobody comes. He gets dressed, goes downstairs wanting some hot water, can't find anybody. He goes to the bedroom that Garcia said was his own bedroom. Garcia is not there. So he leaves and thinks that it might just be like a weird practical joke. And he goes to see, like, if maybe Garcia is trying to get out of paying the rent. And no, the rent had already been paid well in advance. So it's just very odd. And so he asks for Holmes's help. But the inspectors are like, Garcia's dead. He died at 1 a.m. And Eccles is like, that's impossible. I heard him at 1 a.m. I know it was him. So the detectives leave, and Holmes sends out a letter, and Holmes and Watson are talking about possible theories about maybe what has happened. And Holmes is like, obviously, Watson, you simpleton. Garcia said that it was 1 o'clock when really it was earlier in the day to set up an alibi for him being here at 1 o'clock. Because the body of Garcia had to have been murdered before 1 a.m. because it was raining last night, and the body was and he was definitely killed before the rain. And that's where we're at. Interesting. I also think the relationship between Holmes and Watson is also super interesting. Um, like I'm sure they enjoy each other's company, but it also has that undertone of like being fraught a little bit or like distanced and cold a little bit. And every time Sherlock is like, my dear Watson, I just like see him like as like gloating almost to be like, "Ah, you were so close, but you're wrong." And that's how I view it. All right, part two, The Tiger of San Pedro. Sounds mysterious. A cold and melancholy walk of a couple of miles brought us to a high wooden gate, which opened into a gloomy avenue of chestnuts. The curved and shadowed drive led us to a low, dark house, pitch black against a slate-colored sky. From the front window upon the left of the door there peeped a glimmer of a feeble light. "There's a constable in possession," said Baines. "I'll knock at the door." He stepped across the grass plot and tapped with his hand on the pane. Through the fogged glass I dimly saw a man spring up from a chair beside the fire, and heard a sharp cry from within the room. An instant later, a white-faced, hard-breathing policeman had opened the door, the candle wavering in his trembling hands. "What's the matter, Walters?" asked Baines sharply. The man mopped his forehead with his handkerchief and gave a long sigh of relief. "I'm so glad you have come, sir. It has been a long evening, and I don't think my nerves is as good as it was." "Your nerve, Walters?" I should not have thought you had a nerve in your body." "Well, sir, it's this lonely, silent house, and the odd thing in the kitchen. Then, when you tapped at the window, I thought it had come again." "That what had come again?" "The devil, sir, for all I know. It was at the window." "What was at the window, and when?" "It was just 2 hours ago. The light was just fading. I was sitting reading in the chair. I don't know what made me look up, but there was a face looking in at me through the lower pane. Lord, sir, what a face it was! I'll see it in my dreams." "Tut, tut, Walters, this is not the talk for a police constable." "I know, sir, I know, but it shook me, sir, and there's no use to deny it. It wasn't black, sir, nor was it white, nor any color that I know, but an odd shade like clay with a splash of milk in it. Then there was the size of it. It was twice yours, sir, and the look of it, the great, staring, goggle eyes, and the line of white teeth like a hungry beast. I tell you, sir, I couldn't move a finger, nor get my breath, till it whisked away and was gone. Out I ran and through the shrubbery, but thank God there was no one there." "If I didn't know you were a good man, Walters, I should put a black mark against you for this. If it were the devil himself, a constable on duty should never thank God that he could not lay his hand upon him. I suppose the whole thing is not a vision and a touch of nerves?" "That, at least, is very easily settled," said Holmes, lighting his little pocket lantern. "Yes," he reported, after a short examination of the grass bed. "A number 12 shoe, I should say. If he was all on the same scale as his foot, he must certainly have been a giant." "What became of him?" "He seems to have broken through the shrubbery and made for the road." "Well," said the inspector, with a grave and thoughtful face, "whoever he may have been, and whatever he may have wanted, he's gone for the present, and we have more immediate things to attend to. Now, Mr. Holmes, with your permission, I will show you round the house." The various bedrooms and sitting-rooms had yielded nothing to a careful search. Apparently the tenants had bought little or nothing with them, and all the furniture down to the smallest details had been taken over with the house. A good deal of clothing with the stamp of Marks and Company, High Holborn, had been left behind. Telegraphic inquiries had been already made which showed that Marks knew nothing of this customer, save that he was a good payer. Odds and ends, some pipes, a few novels, 2 of them in Spanish, an old-fashioned pin-file revolver, and a guitar were among the personal property. "Nothing in all this," said Baines, stalking, candle in hand, from room to room. "But now, Mr. Holmes, I invite your attention to the kitchen." It was a gloomy, high-ceilinged room in the back of the house, with a straw litter in one corner, which served apparently as a bed for the cook. The table was piled with half-eaten dishes and dirty plates, the debris of last night's dinner. "Look at this," said Baines. "What do you make of it?" He held up his candle before an extraordinary object, which stood at the back of the dresser. It was so wrinkled and shrunken and withered that it was difficult to say what it might have been. One could but say that it was black and leathery, and that it bore some resemblance to a dwarfish human figure. At first, as I examined it, I thought that it was a mummified baby, and then it seemed a very twisted and ancient monkey. Finally, I was left in doubt as to whether it was an animal or human. A double hand of white shells was strung round the center of it. Very interesting indeed," said Holmes, peering at the sinister relic. "Anything more?" In silence, Baines led the way to the sink and held forward his candle. The limbs and body of a large white bird, torn savagely to pieces with the feathers still on, were littered all over it. Holmes pointed to the wattles on the severed head. "Most interesting," said he. "It is really a very curious case." But Mr. Baines had kept his most sinister exhibit to the last. From under the sink he drew a zinc pail which contained a quantity of blood. Then from the table he took a platter heaped with small pieces of charred bone. "Something has been killed, and something has been burned. We raked all these out of the fire. We had a doctor in this morning. He says that they are not human." Holmes smiled and rubbed his hands. "I must congratulate you, Inspector, on handling so distinctive and instructive a case. Your powers, if I may say so without offense, seem superior to your opportunities." Inspector Baines's small eyes twinkled with pleasure. It's so interesting, the compliments, I guess we can call them, that Holmes gives people. Is just very odd. Like, almost backhanded, like, you're actually kind of smart. Unfortunately, you won't make it very far because your position won't allow it. It's so interesting. And there was one earlier, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but I was just like, huh, is that a nice thing to say? Are we being nice? Is this as nice as Holmes gets? Let's see. "You're right, Mr. Holmes. We stagnate in the provinces. A case of this sort gives a man a chance, and I hoped that I shall take it. What do you make of these bones?" "A lamb, I should say. Or a kid." "And the white bird?" "Curious, Mr. Baines, very curious. I should say almost unique. Yes, sir. There must have been some very strange people and some very strange ways in this house. One of them is dead. Did his companions follow him and kill him? If they did, we should have them, for every port is watched. But my own views are different. Yes, sir, my own views are very different." "You have a theory, then?" "And I'll work it myself, Mr. Holmes. It's only due to my own credit to do so. Your name is made, but I have still to make mine. I should be glad to be able to say afterwards that I had solved it without your help." Holmes laughed good-humoredly. "Very well, Inspector," said he. Do you follow your path, and I will follow mine. My results are always very much at your service if you care to apply to me for them. I think that I have seen all that I wish in this house, and that my time may be more profitably employed elsewhere. Au revoir, and good luck." I could tell by numerous subtle signs, which might have been lost upon anyone but myself, that Holmes was on a hot scent. As impassive as ever to the casual observer, there were none the less as a subdued eagerness and suggestion of tension in his brightened eyes and brisker manner which assured me that the game was afoot. After his habit, he said nothing, and after mine, I asked no questions. Sufficient for me to share the sport and lend my humble help to the captor without distracting that intent brain with needless interruption. All would come round to me in due time. I waited, therefore, but to my ever-deepening disappointment, I waited in vain. Day succeeded day, and my friend took no step. One morning he spent in town, and I learned from a casual reference that he had visited the British Museum. Save for this one excursion, he spent his days in long and often solitary walks, or in chatting with a number of village gossips whose acquaintance he had cultivated. "I'm sure, Watson, a week in the country will be invaluable to you," he remarked. "It is very pleasant to see the first green shoots upon the hedges, and the catkins on the hazels once again. With a spud, a tin box, and an elementary book on botany, there are instructive days to be spent." He prowled about with this equipment himself, but it was a poor show of plants which he would bring back of an evening. Occasionally, in our rambles, he came across Inspector Baines. His fat, red face wreathed itself in smiles, and his small eyes glittered as he greeted my companion. He said little about the case, but from that little we gathered that he also was not dissatisfied at the course of events. I must admit, however, that I was somewhat surprised when, some 5 days after the crime, I opened my morning paper to find in large letters, "The Ox-Shot Mystery, a Solution, Arrest of Supposed Assassin." Holmes sprang in his chair as if he had been stung when I read the headlines. "By Jove," he cried, "you don't mean that Baines has got him?" "Apparently," said I, as I read the following report. Great excitement was caused in Esher and the neighboring district when it was learned late last night that an arrest had been effected in connection with the Oxshott murder. It will be remembered that Mr. Garcia, of Wisteria Lodge, was found dead on Oxshott Common, his body showing signs of extreme violence, and that on the same night his servant and his cook fled, which appeared to show their participation in the crime. It was suggested, but never proved, that the deceased gentlemen may have had valuables in the house, and that their abstraction was the motive of the crime. Every effort was made by Inspector Baines, who has the case in hand, to ascertain the hiding place of the fugitives, and he had good reason to believe that they were not gone far, but were lurking in some retreat which had been already prepared. It was certain from the first, however, that they would eventually be detected, as the cook, from the evidence of 1 or 2 tradespeople who have caught a glimpse of him through the window, was a man of most remarkable appearance, being a huge and hideous person. Oh, that's not very nice. With yellowish features of a pronounced type. This man has been since seen in the crime. Has been since seen. Wait, what? This man has been since. This man has been seen since the crime, for he was detected and pursued by Constable Walters on the same evening, when he had the audacity to revisit Wisteria Lodge. Inspector Baines, considering that such a visit must have some purpose in view, and was likely, therefore, to be repeated, abandoned the house, but left in ambuscade in the shrubbery. The man walked into the trap and was captured last night after a struggle in which Constable Downing was badly bitten by the person. We understand that when the prisoner is brought before the magistrates, a remand will be applied for by the police, and that great developments are hoped from his captors. Really, we must see Baines at once, cried Holmes, picking up his hat. We will just catch him before he starts. We hurried down the village street and found, as we had expected, that the inspector was just leaving his lodgings. You've seen the paper, Mr. Holmes? He asked, holding one out to us. Yes, Baines, I've seen it. Pray, don't think it a liberty if I give you a word of friendly warning. Of warning, Mr. Holmes? I have looked into this case with some care, and I am not convinced that you are on the right lines. I don't want you to commit yourself too far unless you are sure. You're very kind, Mr. Holmes. I assure you I speak for your good. It seemed to me that something like a wink quivered for an instant over one of Mr. Baines's tiny eyes. We agreed to work on our own lines, Mr. Holmes. That's what I am doing. Oh, very good, said Holmes. Don't blame me. No, sir. I believe you mean well by me. But we all have our own systems, Mr. Holmes. You have yours, and maybe I have mine. Let us say no more about it. You're welcome always to my news. This fellow is a savage. Oh, that's aggressive. As strong as a cart horse and as fierce as the devil. He chewed Downing's limb nearly off before they could master him. He barely speaks a word of English, and we can get nothing out of him but grunts. And you think you have evidence that he murdered his late master? I didn't say so, Mr. Holmes. I didn't say so. We all have our little ways. You try yours, and I will try mine. That's the agreement. Mr. Holmes shrugged his shoulders as we walked away together. I can't make that man out. He seems to be riding for a fall. Well, as they say, we must each try our own way and see what comes of it. But there's something in Inspector Baines which I can't quite understand. Just sit down in that chair, Watson, said Sherlock Holmes, when we had returned to our apartment at the Bull. I want to put you in touch with the situation, as I may need your help tonight. Let me show you the evolution of this case so far as I have been able to follow it. Simple as it had been in its leading features, it has nonetheless presented surprising difficulties in the way of an arrest. There are gaps in that direction which we still have to fill. We will go back to the note which was handed in to Garcia upon the evening of his death. We may put aside this idea of Baines that Garcia's servants were concerned in the matter. The proof of this lies in the fact that if it was he who had arranged for the presence of Scott Eccles, which could only have been done for the purpose of an alibi, it was Garcia, then, who had an enterprise, and apparently a criminal enterprise, in hand that night in the course of which he met his death. I say criminal, because only a man with criminal enterprise desires to establish an alibi. Who, then, is most likely to have taken his life? Surely the person against whom the criminal enterprise was directed. So far, it seems to me that we are on safe ground. We can now see a reason for the disappearance of Garcia's household. They are all confederates in the same unknown crime. If it came off when Garcia returned, any possible suspicion would be warded off by the Englishman's evidence, and all would be well. But the attempt was a dangerous one, and if Garcia did not return by a certain hour, it was probable that his own life had been sacrificed. It had been arranged, therefore, that in such a case his two subordinates were to make for some pre-arranged spot where they could escape investigation and be in a position afterwards to renew their attempt. That would fully explain the facts, would it not? The whole inexplicable tangle seemed to straighten out before me. I wondered, as I always did, how it had not been obvious to me before. But why should one servant return, then? We can imagine that in the confusion of flight something precious, something which he could not bear to part with, had been left behind. That would explain his persistence, would it not? Well, what is the next step? The next step is the note received by Garcia at the dinner. It indicates a confederate at the other end. Now, where was the other end? I have already shown you that it could only lie in some large house, and that the number of large houses is limited. My first days in this village were devoted to a series of walks, in which, in the intervals of my botanical researches, I made a reconnaissance of all the large houses and an examination of the family history of the occupants. Of course you did. Of course you were doing that, Holmes. It's never just looking at plants, is it? It's always something with him. One house, and only one, riveted my attention. It was the famous old Jacobin Grange of High Gable, 1 mile on the farther side of Oxshott, and less than half a mile from the scene of the tragedy. The other mansions belong to prosaic and respectable people who live far aloof from romance. But Mr. Henderson, of High Gable, was by all accounts a curious man, to whom curious adventures might befall. I concentrated my attention, therefore, upon him and his household. A singular set of people, Watson. The man himself, the most singular of them all. I managed to see him on a plausible pretext, but I seemed to read in his dark, deep-set, brooding eyes that he was perfectly aware of my true business. He is a man of 50, strong, active, with grey hair, great bunched black eyebrows, the step of a deer, and the air of an emperor, a fierce, masterful man, with a red-hot spirit behind his parchment face. He is either a foreigner, or has lived long in the tropics, for he is yellow and sapless, but tough as whipcord. His friend and secretary, Mr. Lucas, is undoubtedly a foreigner. Chocolatey brown, wily, suave, and cat-like, with a poisonous gentleness of speech. You see, Watson, we have come already upon 2 sets of foreigners, one at Wisteria Lodge and one at High Gable. So our gaps are beginning to close. Making a lot of assumptions here, Sherlock. These 2 men, close and confidential friends, are the center of the household. But there is one other person who for our immediate purpose may be even more important. Henderson has 2 children, girls of 11 and 13. Their governess is a Miss Burnett, an Englishwoman of 40 or thereabouts. There is also one confidential manservant. This little group forms a real family, for they travel about together, and Henderson is a great traveler, always on the move. It is only within the last few weeks that he has returned, after a year's absence, to High Gable. I may add that he is enormously rich, and whatever his whims may be, he can very easily satisfy them. For the rest, his house is full of butlers, footmen, maidservants, and the usual overfed, underworked staff of a large English country house. So much I learned partly from village gossip and partly from my own observation. There are no better instruments than discharged servants with a grievance, and I was lucky enough to find one. I call it luck, but it would not have come my way had I not been looking out for it. As Baines remarks, we all have our systems. It was my system which enabled me to find John Warner, late gardener of High Gable, sacked in a moment of temper by his imperious employer. He, in turn, had friends among the indoor servants who unite in their fear and dislike of their master. So I had my key to the secrets of the establishment. Curious people, Watson. I don't pretend to understand it all yet, but very curious people, anyway. It is a double-winged house, and the servants live on one side, the family on the other. There is no link between the 2 save for Henderson's own servant, who serves the family meals. Everything is carried to a certain door, which forms the one connection. Governess and children hardly go out at all, except into the garden. Henderson never by any chance walks alone. His secretary, is like his shadow. The gossip among the servants is that their master is horribly afraid of something. Sold his soul to the devil in exchange for mercy, says Warner, and expects his creditors to come up and claim his own. Where they came from, or who they are, nobody has an idea. They are very violent. Twice Henderson has lashed at folk with his dog whip, and only his long purse and heavy compensation have kept him out of the courts. That's wild. Attacking people with a dog whip? Also, I don't like that there's a dog whip. Well, now, Watson, let us judge the situation by this new information. We may take it that the letter came out of this strange household, and was an invitation to Garcia to carry out some attempt which had already been planned. Who wrote the note? It was someone within the citadel, and it was a woman. But then, who then but Miss Burnett, the governess? All our reasoning seems to point that way. At any rate, we may take it as a hypothesis, and see what consequences it would entail. I may add that Miss Burnett's age and character make it certain that my first idea, that there might be a love interest in our story, is out of the question. If she wrote the note, she was presumably the friend and confederate of Garcia. What, then, might she be expected to do if she heard of his death? If he met in some nefarious enterprise, her lips might be sealed. Still, in her heart, she must retain bitterness and hatred against those who had killed him, and would presumably help so far as she could to have revenge upon them. Could we see her, then, and try to use her? That was my first thought. But now we come to a sinister fact. Miss Burnett has not been seen by any human eye since the night of the murder. From that evening she has utterly vanished. Is she alive? Has she, perhaps, met her end on the same night as the friend whom she had summoned? Or is she merely a prisoner? There is the point which we still have to decide. You will appreciate the difficulty of the situation, Watson. There is nothing upon which we can apply for a warrant. Our whole scheme might seem fantastic if laid before a magistrate. The woman's disappearance counts for nothing, since in that extraordinary household any member of it might be invisible for a week, and yet she may at the present moment be in danger of her life. All I can do is to watch the house and leave my agent, Warner, on guards at the gates. We can't let such a situation continue. If the law can do nothing, we must take the risk ourselves. What do you suggest? I know which is her room. It is accessible from the top of an outhouse. My suggestion is that you and I go tonight and see if we can strike at the very heart of the mystery. It was not, I must confess, a very alluring prospect. The old house, with its atmosphere of murder, the singular and formidable inhabitants, the unknown dangers of the approach, and the fact that we were putting ourselves legally in a false position, all combined to damp my ardor. But there was something in the ice-cold reasoning of Holmes which made it impossible to shrink from any adventure which he might recommend. One knew that thus, and only thus, could a solution be found. I clasped his hand in silence, and the die was cast. But it was not destined that our investigation should starting that sentence over. But it was not destined that our investigation should have so adventurous an ending. It was about 5 o'clock, and the shadows of the March evening were beginning to fall, when an excited rustic rushed into our room. "They've gone, Mr. Holmes. They went by the last train. The lady broke away, and I've got her in a cab downstairs." "Excellent, Warner," cried Holmes, springing to his feet. "Watson, the gaps are closing rapidly." In the cab was a woman, half collapsed from nervous exhaustion. She bore upon her aquiline and emaciated face the traces of some recent tragedy. Her head hung listlessly upon her breast, but as she raised it and turned her dull eyes upon us, I saw that her pupils were dark dots in the center of the broad, gray iris. She was drugged with opium. "I watched at the gate, same as you advised, Mr. Holmes," said our emissary, the discharged gardener. "When the carriage came out, I followed it to the station. She was like one walking in her sleep. But when they tried to get her into the train, she came to life and struggled. They pushed her into the carriage. She fought her way out again. I took her part, got her into the cab, and here we are. I shan't forget the face of the carriage window as I led her away. I'd have a short life if he had his way. The black-eyed, scowling devil." We carried her upstairs, laid her on the sofa, and a couple of cups of the strongest coffee soon cleared her brain from the mists of the drug. Baines had been summoned by Holmes, and the situation rapidly explained to him. "Why, sir, you've got me the very evidence I want," said the inspector warmly, shaking my friend by the hand. "I was on the same scent as you from the first." "What? You were after Henderson?" "Why, Mr. Holmes, when you were crawling in the shrubbery at High Gable, I was up one of the trees in the plantation and saw you down below. It was just who got his evidence first." "Then why did you arrest the other?" Baines chuckled. "I was sure Henderson, as he called himself, felt that he was suspected, and that he would lie low and make no move so long as he thought he was in any danger. I arrested the wrong man to make him believe that our eyes were off him. I knew he would be likely to clear off then and give us a chance of getting at Miss Burnett." Holmes laid his hand upon the inspector's shoulder. "You will rise high in your profession. You have instinct and intuition," said he. Baines flushed with pleasure. I've had a plainclothes man waiting at the station all week. Wherever the High Castle folk go, he will keep them in sight, but he must have been hard put to it when Miss Barnett broke away. However, your man picked her up, and it all ends well. We can't arrest without her evidence, that is clear, so the sooner we get a statement, the better." "Every minute she gets stronger," said Holmes, glancing at the governess. "But tell me, Baines, who is this man Henderson?" "Henderson," the inspector answered, "is Don Murillo, once called the Tiger of San Pedro." The Tiger of San Pedro. The whole history of the man came back to me in a flash. He had made his name as the most lewd and bloodthirsty tyrant that had ever governed any country with a pretense to civilization. Strong, fearless, and energetic, he had sufficient virtue to enable him to impose his odious vices upon a cowering people for 10 or 12 years. His name was a terror through all Central America. At the end of that time, there was a universal rising against him, but he was as cunning as he was cruel, and at the first whisper of coming trouble, he had secretly conveyed his treasures aboard a ship which was manned by devoted adherents. It was an empty palace which was stormed by the insurgents that day. The dictator, his 2 children, his secretary, and his wealth had all escaped them. From that moment he had vanished from the world, and his identity had been a frequent subject for comment in the European press. "Yes, sir, Don Murillo, the Tiger of San Pedro," said Baines. "If you look it up, you will find that the San Pedro colors are green and white, same as in the note, Mr. Holmes. Henderson, he called himself, but I traced him back, Paris and Rome and Madrid and Barcelona, where his ship came in '86. They've been looking for him all the time for their revenge, but it is only now that they have begun to find him out." They discovered him a year ago, said Miss Barnett, who had sat up and was now intently following the conversation. Once already his life had been attempted, but some evil spirit shielded him. Now again it is the noble, chivalrous Garcia who has fallen, while the monster goes safe. But another will come, and yet another, until some day justice will be done. That is as certain as the rise of tomorrow's sun. Her thin hands clenched, and her worn face blanched with the passion of her hatred. But how come you into what? But how come you into this matter, Miss Burnett? Asked Holmes. That is an odd way to phrase that sentence, or that question. And when I tell you that I stumbled, we all witnessed it. We all heard it. You know. How can an English lady join in such a murderous affair? I join in it because there is no other way in the world by which justice can be gained. What does the law of England care for the rivers of blood shed years ago in San Pedro, or for the shipload of treasures which this man has stolen? To you they are like crimes committed in some other planet, but we know. We have learned the truth in sorrow and in suffering. To us there is no fiend in hell like Juan Murillo, and no peace in life while his victims still cry for vengeance. No doubt, said Holmes. He was, as you say. I have heard that he was atrocious. But how are you affected? I will tell you it all. This villain's policy was to murder, on one pretext or another, every man who showed such promise that he might in time come to be a dangerous rival. My husband, yes, my real name is Signora Victor Durando, was the San Pedro minister in London. He met me and married me there. A nobler man never lived upon earth. Unhappily, Murillo heard of his excellence, recalled him on some pretext, and had him shot. With a premonition of his fate, he had refused to take me with him. His estates were confiscated, and I was left with a pittance and a broken heart. Then came the downfall of the tyrant. He escaped, as you just have described. But the many whose lives he had ruined, whose nearest and dearest had suffered torture and death at his hands, would not let the matter rest. They banded themselves into a society which should never be dissolved until the work was done. It was my part, after we had discovered in the transformed Henderson the fallen depot, to attach myself to his household and keep the others in touch with his movements. This I was able to do by securing the position of governess in his family. He little knew that the woman who faced him at every meal was the woman whose husband he had hurried at an hour's notice into eternity. I smiled on him, did my duty to his children, and bid my time. An attempt was made in Paris and failed. We zigzagged swiftly here and there over Europe to throw off the pursuers, and finally returned to this house, where he had taken upon his first arrival in England. But here also the Minister of Justice was waiting, knowing that he would return there. Garcia, who is the son of the former highest dignitary in San Pedro, was waiting with two trusty companions of humble station, all three fired with the same reasons for revenge. He could do little during the day, for Murillo took every precaution and never went out save with his satellite Lucas, or Lopez, as he was known in the days of his greatness. At night, however, he slept alone, and the avenger might find him. On a certain evening, which had been pre-arranged, I sent my friend final instructions, for the man was forever on the alert and continually changed his room. I was to see that the doors were open, and the signal of a green or white light in a window which faced the drive was to give notice if all was safe, or if the attempt had better be postponed. But everything went wrong with us. In some way I had excited the suspicion of Lopez, the secretary. He crept up behind me and sprang upon me just as I had finished the note. He and his master dragged me to my room and held judgment upon me as a convicted traitress. Then and there they would have plunged their knives into me could they have seen how to escape the consequences of the deed. Finally, after much debate, they concluded that my murder was too dangerous, but they determined to get rid forever of Garcia. They had gagged me, and Murillo twisted my arm round until I gave him the address. I swear that he might have twisted it off had I understood what it would mean to Garcia. Lopez addressed the note which I had written, sealed it with his sleeve ink, and sent it by the hand of his servant Jose. How they murdered him I do not know, save that it was Murillo's hand who struck him down, for Lopez had remained to guard me. I believe he must have waited among the gorse. That is not what it says. It does not say gorse. Gorse. I have such a hard time sometimes with just plain S sounds and sh sounds, and I mix them up all the gosh darn time. Okay. I believe he must have waited among the gorse bushes through which the path winds and struck him down as he passed. At first, they were of a mind to let him enter the house and to kill him as a detected burglar, but they argued that if they were mixed up in an inquiry their own identity would at once be publicly disclosed, and they would be open to further attacks. With the death of Garcia, the pursuit might cease, since such a death might frighten others from the task. All would now have been well for them had it not been for my knowledge of what they had done. I have no doubt that there were times when my life hung in the balance. I was confined to my room, terrorized by the most horrible threats, cruelly ill-used to break my spirit. See the stab on my shoulder, and the bruises from end to end of my arms, and a gag was thrust into my mouth on one occasion when I tried to call from the window. For 5 days this cruel imprisonment continued, with hardly enough food to hold body and soul together. This afternoon a good lunch was brought me, but the moment after I took it I knew that I had been drugged. In a sort of dream I remembered being half led, half carried to the carriage. In the same state I was conveyed to the train. Only then, when the wheels were almost moving, did I suddenly realize that my liberty lay in my own hands. I sprang out. They tried to drag me back, and had it not been for the help of this good man who led me to the cab, I should never have broken away. Now, thank God, I am beyond their power forever. We had all listened intently to this remarkable statement. It was Holmes who broke the silence. "Our difficulties are not over," he remarked, shaking his head. "Our police work ends, but our legal work begins." "Exactly," said I. "A plausible lawyer could make it out as an act of self-defense. There may be 100 crimes in the background, but it is only on this one that they can be tried." "Come, come," said Baines cheerily. "I think better of the law than that. Self-defense is one thing. To entice a man in cold blood with the object of murdering him is another, whatever danger you may fear from him. No, no, we shall all be justified when they see the tenants of High Gable at the next Guilford. Assizes? 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 Assizes. We're going with it. It's fine. It's fine. It is a matter of history, however, that a little time was still to elapse before the tiger of San Pedro should meet with his deserts. Wily and bold, he and his companion threw their pursuers off their track by entering a lodging-house in Edmonton Street and leaving by the back gate into Curzon Square. From that day they were seen no more in England. Some 6 months afterwards the Marquis of Montalva and Signor Rui, his secretary, were both murdered in their rooms at the Hotel Escurial at Madrid. The crime was ascribed to nihilism, and the murderers were never arrested. Inspector Baines visited us at Baker Street with a printed description of the face of the secretary and of the masterful features, the magnetic eyes, and the tufted brows of his master. He could not doubt that justice, if belated, had come at last. "A chaotic case, my dear Watson," said Holmes over an evening pipe. "It will not be possible for you to present it in that compact form which is dear to your heart. It covers 2 continents, concerns 2 groups of mysterious persons, and is further complicated by the highly respectable presence of our friend Scott Eccles, whose inclusion shows me that the deceased Garcia had a scheming mind and a well-developed instinct of self-preservation. It is remarkable only for the fact that amid a perfect jungle of possibilities we, with our worthy collaborator, the inspector, have kept our close hold on the essentials, and so been guided along the crooked and winding path. Is there any point which is not quite clear to you?" So I love that Holmes is like, well, this case is just far too large. There's no way that you're going to be able to fit it into your tiny little notebook, Watson. But that's exactly what we're reading, is his writing of this event in his tiny little notebook. The subject of the cook's return. I think that the strange creature in the kitchen may account for it. The man was primitive, from the backwoods of San Pedro, and this was his fetish. All right. When his companion and he had fled to some pre-arranged retreat, already occupied, no doubt, by a confederate, the companion had pursued him to leave so compromising an article of furniture. But his heart was with it, and he was driven back to it next day, when, on reconnoitering through the window, he found Policeman Walters in possession. He waited 3 days longer, and then his piety, or his superstition, drove him to try once more. Inspector Baines, who, with his usual astuteness, had minimized the incident before me, and had recognized its importance, and had left a trap into which the creature walked. Any other point, Watson? The torn bird, the pail of blood, the charred bones, all the mystery of that weird kitchen. Holmes smiled as he turned up an entry in his notebook. "I spent a morning in the British Museum reading up on that and other points. Here is a quotation from Ackerman's Voodooism and Religions. The true voodoo worshipper attempts nothing of importance without certain sacrifices which are intended to propitiate his unclean gods. In extreme cases, these rites take the form of human sacrifices followed by cannibalism. The more usual victims are of a white bird, which is plucked in pieces alive, or a black goat, whose throat is cut and body burned. So you see, our friend was very orthodox in his ritual. It is grotesque, Watson," Holmes added as he slowly fastened his notebook. "But, as I have had occasion to remark, there is but one step from the grotesque to the horrible." And that is the end of The Adventure of Wisteria Lodge. I forgot what it was called for a second. The end of The Adventure of Wisteria Lodge. I like how we went full circle at the very beginning. Watson and Holmes were discussing the usage of the word grotesque and what it actually means versus the feelings or the implications of the word. And so it full circled it back. Well done. We'll do another story. Heck yeah, we will. Oh man. Okay, this next one, I looked at what it's called and it sounds so silly. It's The Adventure of the Cardboard Box. Wild. All right. The Adventure of the Cardboard Box. In choosing a few typical cases which illustrate the remarkable mental qualities of my friend, Sherlock Holmes, I have endeavored, as far as possible, to select those which have presented the the minimum of sensationalism, while offering a fair field for his talents. It is, however, unfortunately impossible entirely to separate the sensational from the criminal, and a chronicler is left in the dilemma that he must either sacrifice details which are essential to his statement, and so give a false impression of the problem, or he must use matter which chance, and not chance, has provided him with. With this short preface, I shall turn to my notes of what proved to be a strange, though a particularly terrible, chain of events. Ooh, I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued. Watson, you've hooked me. It was a blazing hot day in August. Baker Street was like an oven, and the glare of the sunlight upon the yellow brickwork of the house across the road was painful to the eye. It was hard to believe that these were the same walls which loomed so gloomily through the fogs of winter. Our blinds were half drawn, and Holmes lay curled upon the sofa, reading and rereading a letter which he had received by the morning post. For myself, my term of service in India had trained me to stand heat better than cold, and a thermometer at 90 was no hardship. But the morning paper was uninteresting. Parliament had risen. Everybody was out of town, and I yearned for the glades of the New Forest or the shingle of Southsea. A depleted bank account had caused me to postpone my holiday, and as to my companion, neither the country nor the sea presented the slightest attraction to him. He loved to lie in the very center of 5 millions of people, with his filaments stretched out and running through them, responsive to every little rumor or suspicion of unsolved crime. Appreciation of nature found no place among his many gifts, and his only change was when he turned his mind from the evildoer of the town to track down his brother of the country. Finding that Holmes was too absurd for convention, I had tossed aside the barren paper, and leaning back in my chair, I fell into a brown study. Suddenly, my companion's voice broke in upon my thoughts. "You are right, Watson," said he. "It does seem a most preposterous way of settling a dispute." "Most preposterous," I exclaimed, and then suddenly realizing how he had echoed the inmost thought of my soul, I sat up in my chair and stared at him in blank amazement. "What is this, Holmes?" I cried. "This is beyond anything which I could have imagined." He laughed heartily at my perplexity. "You remember," said he, "that some little time ago, when I was reading you the passage in one of Poe's sketches, in which a close reasoner follows the unspoken thoughts of his companion, you were inclined to treat the matter as a mere tour de force of the author. On my remarking that I was constantly in the habit of doing the same thing, you expressed incredulity. Oh, no. Perhaps not with your tongue, my dear Watson, but certainly with your eyebrows." "Your eyebrows speak volumes, Watson. Calm them." "So when I saw you throw down your paper and enter upon a train of thought, I was very happy to have the opportunity of reading it off, and eventually of breaking into it, as a proof that I had been in rapport with you." But I was still far from satisfied. "In the example which you read to me," said I, "the reasoner drew his conclusions from the actions of the man whom he observed. If I remember right, he stumbled over a heap of stones, looked up at the stars, and so on. But I have been seated quietly in my chair, and what clues can I have given you?" "You do yourself an injustice. The features are given to man as the means by which he shall express his emotions, and yours are faithful servants." "Do you mean to say that you read my train of thoughts from my features?" "Your features, and especially your eyes. Perhaps you cannot yourself recall how your reverie commenced?" "No, I cannot." Then I will tell you. After throwing down your paper, which was the action which drew my attention to you, you sat for half a minute with a vacant expression. Then your eyes fixed themselves upon your newly framed picture of General Gordon, and I sat by the alteration in your face that a train of thought had been started. But it did not lead very far. Your eyes flashed across to the unframed portrait of Henry Ward Beecher, which stands upon the top of your books. Then you glanced up at the wall, and of course your meaning was obvious. You were thinking that if the portrait were framed, it would just cover that bare space and correspond with Gordon's picture over there. "You have followed me wonderfully," I exclaimed. "So far I could hardly have gone astray. But now your thoughts went back to Beecher, and you looked hard across as if you were studying the character in his features. Then your eyes ceased to pucker, but you continued to look across, and your face was thoughtful. You were recalling the incidents of Beecher's career. I was well aware that you could not do this without thinking of the mission which he undertook on behalf of the North at the time of the Civil War, for I remember your expressing your passionate indignation at the way in which he was receiving in the way by which he was received by the more turbulent of our people. You felt so strongly about it that I knew you could not think of Beecher without thinking of that also. When a moment later I saw your eyes wander away from the picture, I suspected that your mind had now turned to the Civil War, and when I observed that your lips set, your eyes sparked, and your hands clenched, I was positive that you were indeed thinking about the gallantry which was shown by both sides in that desperate struggle. By then again your face grew sadder. You shook your head. You were dwelling upon the sadness and horror and useless waste of life. Your hand stole towards your own old wound, and a smile quivered on your lips, which showed me that the ridiculous side of this method of settling international questions had forced itself upon your mind. At this point I agreed with you that it was preposterous, and was glad to find that all my deductions had been correct. "Absolutely," said I, "and now you have explained it, I confess that I am as amazed as before." "It was very superficial, my dear Watson, I assure you. I should not have intruded it upon my attention had you not shown some incredulity the other day. But I have in my hands here a little problem which may prove to be more difficult of solution than my small essay in thought reading. Have you observed in the paper a short paragraph referring to the remarkable contents of a packet sent through the post to Miss Cushing of Cross Street, Croydon?" "No, I saw nothing." "Ah, then you must have overlooked it. Just toss it over to me. Here it is, under the financial column. Perhaps you would be good enough to read it aloud." I picked up the paper, which he had thrown back at me, and read the paragraph indicated. It was headed, "A Gruesome Packet." "Miss Susan Cushing, living at Cross Street, Croydon, has been made the victim of what must be regarded as a particularly revolting practical joke, unless some more sinister meaning should prove to be attached to the incident. At 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon a small packet, wrapped in brown paper, was handed in by the postman. A cardboard box was inside, which was filled with coarse salt. On emptying this, Miss Cushing was horrified to find 2 human ears, apparently quite freshly severed." She already had ears. Oh my gosh, what is she gonna do with 2 more? What a terrible gift. The box had been sent by parcel post from Belfast upon the morning before. There is no indication as to the sender, and the matter is the more mysterious as Miss Cushing, who is a maiden lady of 50, had led a most retired life, and has so few acquaintances or correspondents that it is a rare event for her to receive anything through the post. Some years ago, however, when she resided at Peng, she let apartments in her house to 3 young medical students, whom she was obliged to get rid of on account of their noisy and irregular habits. The police are of opinion that this outrage may have been perpetrated upon Miss Cushing by these youths, who owed her a grudge, and who hoped to frighten her by sending her these relics of the dissecting rooms. Some probability is lent to the theory by the fact that one of these students came from the north of Ireland, and, to the best of Miss Cushing's belief, from Belfast. In the meantime, the matter is being actively investigated, Mr. Lestrade, one of the very smartest of our detective officers, being in charge of the case. So much for the Daily Chronicle, said Holmes as I finished reading. Now for your friend Lestrade, I had a note from him this morning, in which he says, I think that this case is very much in your line. We have every hope of clearing this matter up, but we find a little difficulty in getting anything to work upon. We have, of course, wired to the Belfast post office, but a large number of parcels were handed in upon that day, and they have no means of identifying this particular one, or of remembering the sender. The box is a half-pound box of honeydew tobacco, and does not help us in any way. The medical student theory still appears to me to be the most feasible, but if you should have a few hours to spare, I should be very happy to see you out there. I shall be either at the house or in the police station all day. What do you say, Watson? Can you rise superior to the heat and run down to Croydon with me on the off chance of a case for your annals? I was longing for something to do. You shall have it, then. Ring for our boots, and tell them to order a cab. I'll be back in a moment, when I have changed my dressing-gown and filled my cigar-case. A shower of rain fell while we were in the train, and the heat was far less oppressive in Croydon than in town. Holmes had sent on a wire, so that Lestrade, as wiry, as dapper, and as ferret-like as ever, was waiting for us at the station. A walk of 5 minutes took us to Cross Street, where Miss Cushing resided. It was a very long street of 2-story brick houses, neat and prim, with whitened stone steps and little groups of aproned women gossiping at the doors. Halfway down, Lestrade stopped and tapped at a door, which was opened by a small servant girl. Miss Cushing was sitting in the front room, into which we were ushered. She was a placid-faced woman, with large, gentle eyes, and grizzled hair curving down over her temples on each side. A worked antimacassar? Maybe. Antimacassar. A cover for the back or arms of a chair or sofa, originally to prevent them from being soiled by macassar oil. There you go. Macassar. Where was I? Here we are. They're in the outhouse, those dreadful things, said she, as Lestrade entered. I wish that you would take them away altogether. So I shall, Miss Cushing. I only kept them here until my friend, Mr. Holmes, should have seen them in your presence. Why in my presence, sir? In case he wished to ask you any questions. What is the use of asking me questions when I tell you I know nothing whatever about it? Quite so, madam, said Holmes in a soothing way. I have no doubt that you have been annoyed more than enough already over this business. Indeed, I have, sir. I am a quiet woman, and live a retired life. It is something new for me to hear my name in the papers and to find the police in my home. I won't have those things in here, Mr. Lestrade. If you wish to see them, you must go to the outhouse. There was a small shed in a narrow garden, which ran behind the house. Lestrade went in and brought out a yellow cardboard box, with a piece of browned paper and some string. There was a bench at the end of the path, and we all sat down while Holmes examined, one by one, the articles which Lestrade had handed to him. The string is exceedingly interesting, he said, holding it up to the light and sniffing it. What do you make of the string, Lestrade? It has been tarred. Precisely. It is a piece of tarred twine. We have also, no doubt, remarked that Miss Cushing has cut the cord with a scissor, as can be seen by the double fray on each side. This is of importance." "I cannot see the importance," said Lestrade. "The importance lies in the fact that the knot is left intact, and that this knot is of a peculiar character." "It is very neatly tied. I had already made a note of that effect," said Lestrade complacently. "So much for the string, then," said Holmes, smiling. "Now for the box wrapper. Brown paper, with a distinct smell of coffee. What, did you not observe it? I think there can be no doubt of it. Address printed in rather straggly characters, Miss S. Cushing, Cross Street, Croydon. Done with a broad pointed pen, probably a J, with very inferior ink. The word Croydon had been originally spelled with an I, which has been changed to Y. The parcel was directed then by a man, and printed in distinctly masculine, of limited education and unacquainted with the town of Croydon. So far so good. The box is a yellow half-pound honeydew box, with nothing distinctive save 2 thumb marks at the left bottom corner. It is filled with rough salt of the quantity used for preserving hides and other of the coarser commercial purposes, and embedded in it are these very singular enclosures. He took out the 2 ears as he spoke, and laying a board across his knee he examined them minutely, while Lestrade and I, bending forward on each side of him, glanced alternately at these dreadful relics and at the thoughtful, eager face of our companion. Finally, he returned them to the box once more and sat for a while in deep meditation. "You have observed, of course," said he, at last, "that the ears are not a pair." "Yes, I have noticed that. But if this were a practical joke of some students from the dissecting room, it would be as easy for them to send 2 odd ears as a pair." "Precisely. But this is not a practical joke." "Are you sure?" "The presumption is strongly against it. Bodies in the dissecting rooms are injected with preservation fluid. These ears bear no signs of this. They are fresh, too. They have been cut off with a blunt instrument, which would hardly happen if a student had done it. Again, carbolic or rectified spirits would be the preservatives which would suggest themselves to be medical mind, certainly not rough salt. I repeat that there is no practical joke here, but that we are investigating a serious crime." A vague thrill ran through me as I listened to my companion's words, and saw the stern gravity which had hardened his features. This brutal preliminary seemed to shadow forth some strange and inexplicable horror in the background. Lestrade, however, shook his head like a man who is only half convinced. "There are objections to the joke theory, no doubt," said he, "but there are much stronger reasons against the other. We know that this woman has led a most quiet and respectable life here at Peg, and here for the last 20 years. She has hardly been away from her home for a day during that time. Why on earth, then, should any criminal send her the proofs of his guilt, especially as, unless she is a most consummate actress, she understands quite as little of the matter as we do?" "That is the problem which we have to solve," Holmes answered, "and for my part I shall set about it by presuming that my reasoning is correct, and that a double murder has been committed. One of these ears is a woman's, small, finely formed, and pierced for an earring. The other is a man's, sunburned, discolored, and also pierced for an earring. These 2 people are presumably dead, or we should have heard their story before now. Today is Friday. The packet was posted on Thursday morning. The tragedy, then, occurred on Wednesday or Tuesday or earlier. If the 2 people were murdered, who but their murderer would have sent this sign of his work to Miss Cushing? We may take it that the sender of the packet is the man whom we want. But we must have some strong reason for sending Miss Cushing the packet. What reason, then? It must have been to tell her that the deed was done, or to pain her, perhaps. But in this case she knows who it is. Does she know? I doubt it. If she knew, why would she call the police in? She must have buried the ears, and no one would have been the wiser. That is what she would have done if she had wished to shield the criminal. But if she does not wish to shield him, she would give his name. There is a tangle here which needs straightening out. He had been talking in a high, quick voice, staring blankly up over the garden fence, but now he sprang briskly to his feet and walked towards the house. "I have a few questions to ask Miss Cushing," said he. "In that case I may leave you here," said Lestrade, "for I have another small business on hand. I think that I have nothing further to learn from Miss Cushing. You'll find me at the police station." "We shall look in on our way to the train," answered Holmes. A moment later he and I were back in the front room, where the impassive lady was still quietly working away at her antimacassar. I should just see how to pronounce it.
Antimacassar.
Antimacassar. There we go. Now, here we go. She was quietly working away on her antimacassar. She put it down on her lap as we entered and looked at us with her frank, searching blue eyes. "I am convinced, sir," she said, "that this matter is a mistake, and that the parcel was never meant for me at all. I have said this several times to the gentleman from Scotland Yard, but he simply laughs at me. I have not an enemy in the world, as far as I know. So why should someone play such a trick?" "I am coming to be of the same opinion, Miss Cushing," said Holmes, taking a seat beside her. "I think that it is more than probable." He paused, and I was surprised, on glancing round, to see that he was staring with singular intentness at the lady's profile. Surprise and satisfaction were both for an instant to be read upon his eager face, though when she glanced round to find out the cause of his silence, he had become as demure as ever. I stared hard myself at her flat, grizzled hair, her trim cap, her little gilt earrings, her placid features, but I could see nothing which would account for my companion's evident excitement. "There are one or two questions." "Oh, I am weary of questions," cried Miss Cushing impatiently. "You have two sisters, I believe." "How could you know that?" "I observed the very instant that I entered the room that you have a portrait group of three ladies upon the mantelpiece, one of whom is undoubtedly yourself, while the others are so exceedingly like you that there could be no doubt of the relationship." "Yes, you are quite right. Those are my sisters, Sarah and Mary." "And here at my elbow is another portrait, taken at Liverpool, of your younger sister, in the company of a man who appears to be a steward by his uniform. I observe that she was unmarried at the time." "You are very quick at observing." "That is my trade." "Well, you are quite right, but she was married to Mr. Browner a few days afterward. He was on the South American line when that was taken, but he was so fond of her that he couldn't abide to leave her for so long, and he got into the Liverpool and London boats." "Ah, the Conqueror, perhaps." "No, the Mayday, when I last heard. Jim came down here to see me once. That was before he broke the pledge, but afterwards he would always take drink when he was ashore, and a little drink would send him staring mad. Ugh, it was as bad that day that ever he took a glass in his hand again. First he dropped me, then he quarreled with Sarah, and now that Mary has stopped writing, we don't know how things are going on with them." It was evident that Miss Cushing had come upon a subject on which she felt very deeply. Like most people who lead a lonely life, she was very shy at first, but ended by becoming extremely communicative. She told us many details about her brother-in-law, the steward, and then wandering off on the subject of her former lodgers, the medical students, who gave us a long account of their delinquencies, with their names and those of their hospitals. Holmes listened attentively to everything, throwing in a question from time to time. "About your second sister, Sarah," he asked. "I wonder, since you are both maiden ladies, that you do not keep house together." "Ah, you don't know Sarah's temper, or you would wonder no more. I tried it when I came to Croydon, and she kept on until about 2 months ago, when we had to part. I don't want to say a word against my own sister, but she was always meddlesome and hard to please, was Sarah." "You say that she quarreled with your Liverpool relatives?" "Yes, and they were the best of friends at one time. Why, she went up there to live in order to be near them, and now she has no word hard enough for Jim Browner. The last 6 months that she was here, she could speak of nothing but his drinking and his ways. He had caught her meddling, I suspect, and given her a bit of his mind, and that was the start of it." "Thank you, Miss Cushing," said Holmes, rising and bowing. "Your sister Sarah lives, I think you said, at New Street, Wallington. Good-bye. I am very sorry that you should have been troubled over a case with which, as you say, you have nothing whatever to do." There was a cab passing as we came out, and Holmes hailed it. "How far to Wallington?" he asked. "Only about a mile, sir." "Very good. Jump in, Watson. We must strike while the iron is hot. Simple as the case is, there have been one or two very instructive details in connection with it. Just pull up at the telegraph office as you pass, cabby." Holmes sent off a short wire, and for the rest of the drive lay back in the cab, with his hat tilted over his nose to keep the sun from his face. Our driver pulled up at a house which was not unlike the one which we had just quitted. My companion ordered him to stay, and had his hand upon the knocker, when the door opened, and a grave young gentleman in black, with a very shiny hat, appeared on the step. "Is Miss Cushing at home?" asked Holmes. "Miss Sarah Cushing is extremely ill," said he. "She has been suffering since yesterday from brain symptoms of great severity. As her medical adviser, I cannot possibly take the responsibility of allowing anyone to see her. I should recommend you to call again in 10 days. He drew on his gloves, closed the door, and marched off down the street. "Well, if we can't, we can't," said Holmes cheerfully. "Perhaps she could not, or would not, have told you much. I did not wish her to tell me anything. I only wanted to look at her. However, I think that I have got all I want. Drive us to some decent hotel, cabby, where we may have some lunch, and afterwards we shall drop down upon your friend Lestrade at the police station." We had a pleasant little meal together, during which Holmes would talk about nothing but violins, narrating with great exultation how he had purchased his own Stradivarius, which was worth at least 500 guineas, at a broker's in Tottenham Court Road for 55 shillings. This led him to Bikini, and we sat for an hour over a bottle of claret, while he told me anecdote after anecdote of that extraordinary man. The afternoon was far advanced, and the hot glare had softened into a mellow glow before we found ourselves at the police station. Lestrade was waiting for us at the door. "A telegram for you, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Ha! It is an answer." He tore it open, glanced his eyes over it, and crumpled it into his pocket. "That's all right," said he. "Have you found anything out?" "I have found out everything." "What?" Lestrade stared at him in amazement. "You are joking." "I was never more serious in my life. A shocking crime has been committed, and I think I have now laid bare every detail of it." "And the criminal?" Holmes scribbled a few words upon the back of one of his visiting cards and threw it over at Lestrade. "That is the name," said he. "You cannot effect an arrest until tomorrow night at the earliest. I should prefer that you do not mention my name at all in connection with the case, as I choose to be only associated with those crimes which present some difficulty in their solution. Come on, Watson. We strode off together to the station, leaving Lestrade still staring with a delighted face at the card which Holmes had thrown him. I kind of love that. He's like, I solved your case, but please don't mention me because this case wasn't hard. It was not difficult by any means, and I only want my name to be associated with cases that are, like, challenging. Alright? So you can take this one. The case, said Holmes, as we chatted over our cigars that night in our rooms at Baker Street, is one where, as in the investigations which you have chronicled under the names of A Study in Scarlet and of The Sign of Four, we have compelled to reason backward from effects to causes. I have written to Lestrade asking him to supply us with the details which are now wanting, and which he will only get after he has secured his man. That he may be safely trusted to do so, for although he is absolutely devoid of reason, he is as tenacious as a bulldog when he once understands what he has to do, and, indeed, it is just this tenacity which has brought him to the top of Scotland Yard. Our case is not complete, then? I asked. It is fairly complete in essentials. We know who the author of the revolting business is, although one of the victims still escapes us. Of course, you have formed your own conclusions? I presume that this Jim Browner, the steward of Liverpool boat, is the man whom you suspect? Oh, it is more than a suspicion. And yet I cannot see anything save very vague indications. On the contrary, to my mind nothing could be more clear. Let me run over the principal steps. We approached the case, you remember, with an absolutely blank mind, which is always an advantage. We had formed no theories. We were simply there to observe and to draw inferences from our observations. What did you see first? A very placid and respectable lady, who seemed quite innocent of any secret, and a portrait which showed me that she had two younger sisters. It instantly flashed across my mind that the box might have been meant for one of these. I set the idea aside as one which could be disproved or confirmed at our leisure. Then we went to the garden, as you remember, and we saw the very singular contents of the little yellow box. The string was of the quality which is used by sailmakers aboard ship, and at once a whiff of the sea was perceptible in our investigation. When I observed that the knot was one which is popular with sailors, that the parcel had been posted at a port, and that the male ear was pierced for an earring which is so much more common among sailors than landsmen, I was quite certain that all the actors in the tragedy were to be found among our seafaring classes. When I came to examine the address of the packet, I observed that it was to Miss S. Cushing. Now, the oldest sister would, of course, be called Miss Cushing, and although her initial was S, it might belong to one of the others as well. In that case, we should have to commence our investigations from a fresh basis altogether. I therefore went into the house with the intention of clearing up this point. I was about to assure Miss Cushing that I was convinced that a mistake had been made when you may remember that I came suddenly to a stop. The fact was that I had just seen something which filled me with surprise, and at the same time narrowed the field of our inquiry immensely. As a medical man, you are aware, Watson, that there is no part of the body which varies so much as the human ear. Each ear is, as a rule, quite distinctive, and differs from all other ones. In the last year's Anthropological Journal, you will find 2 short monographs from my pen upon the subject. I had, therefore, examined the ears in the box with the eyes of an expert, and had carefully noted their anatomical peculiarities. Imagine my surprise, then, when on looking at Miss Cushing, I perceived that her ear corresponded exactly with the female ear which I had just inspected. The matter was entirely beyond coincidence. There was the same shortening of the pinna, the same broad curve of the upper lobe, the same convolution of the inner cartilage. In all essentials, it was the same ear. Of course, I at once saw the enormous importance of the observation. It was evident that the victim was a blood relation, and probably a very close one. I began to talk to her about her family, and you remember that she at once gave us some exceedingly valuable details. In the first place, her sister's name was Sarah, and her address had until recently been the same, so that it was quite obvious how the mistake had occurred, and for whom the package was meant. Then we heard of the steward married to the third sister, and learned that he had at one time been so intimate with Miss Sarah that she had actually gone up to Liverpool to be near the Browners, but a quarrel had afterwards divided them. This quarrel had put a stop to all communications for some months, so that if Browner had occasion to address a packet to Miss Sarah, he would undoubtedly have done so to her old address. And now the matter had begun to straighten itself out wonderfully. We had learned of the existence of this steward and impulsive man, of strong passions. You remember that he threw up when what must have been a very superior birth in order to be nearer to his wife, subject to occasional fits of hard drinking. We had reason to believe that his wife had been murdered, and that a man, presumably a seafaring man, had been murdered at the same time. Jealousy, of course, at once suggests itself as the motive for the crime, and why should these proofs of the deed be sent to Miss Sarah Cushing? Probably because during her residence in Liverpool she had some hand in bringing out the events which led to the tragedy. You will observe that this line of boats calls at Belfast, Dublin, and Waterford, so that, presuming that Browner had committed the deed, he had embarked at once upon his steamer, the Mayday. Belfast would be the first place at which he would post his terrible packet. A second solution was at this stage obviously possible, and although I thought it exceedingly unlikely, I was determined to elucidate it before going further. An unsuccessful lover might have killed Mr. and Mrs. Browner, and the male ear might have belonged to the husband. There were many grave objections to this theory, but it was conceivable. I therefore sent off a telegram to my friend Algar, of the Liverpool force, and asked him to find out if Miss Browner were at home, and if Browner had departed in the Mayday. Then we went on to Wallington to visit Miss Sarah. I was curious, in the first place, to see how far the family ear had been reproduced in her. Then, of course, she might give us very important information, but I was not sanguine that she would. She must have heard of the business the day before, since all Croydon was ringing with it, and she alone could have understood for whom the packet was meant. If she had been willing to help justice, she would probably have communicated with the police already. However, it was clearly our duty to see her, so we went. We found that the news of the arrival of the packet, for her illness dated from that time, had such an effect upon her as to bring on brain fever. It was clearer than ever that she understood its full significance, but equally clear that we should have to wait some time for any assistance from her. However, we were really independent of her help. Our answers were waiting for us at the police station, where I directed Algar to send them. Nothing could be more conclusive. Mrs. Browner's house had been closed for more than 3 days, and the neighbors were of opinion that she had gone south to see her relatives. It had been ascertained at the shipping offices that Browner had left aboard of the Mayday, and I calculate that she is due in the Thames tomorrow night. When he arrives, he will be met by the obtuse but resolute Lestrade, and I have no doubt that we shall have all our details filled in. Sherlock Holmes was not disappointed in his expectations. 2 days later, he received a bulky envelope, which contained a short note from the detective and a typewritten document which covered several pages of foolscap. "Lestrade has got him all right," said Holmes, glancing up at me. "Perhaps it would interest you to hear what he says. My dear Mr. Holmes, in accordance with the scheme which we had formed in order to test our theories, the we is rather fine, Watson, is it not? I went down to the Albert Dock yesterday at 6 p.m. and boarded the S.S. Mayday, belonging to the Liverpool, Dublin, and London Steam Packet Company. On inquiry, I found that there was a steward on board of the name of James Browner, and that he had acted during the voyage in such an extraordinary manner that the captain had been compelled to relieve him of his duties. On descending to his berth, I found him seated upon a chest with his head sunk upon his hands, rocking himself to and fro. He is a big, powerful chap, clean-shaven and very swarthy, something like Aldridge, who helped us in the bogus laundry affair. He jumped up when he heard my business, and I had my whistle to my lips to call a couple of river police who were round the corner, but he seemed to have no heart in him, and he held out his hands quietly enough for the darbies. We brought him along to the cells, and his box as well, for we thought there might be something incriminating. But, bar a big sharp knife, such as most sailors have, we got nothing for our trouble. However, we find that we shall want no more evidence, for on being brought before the inspector at the station he asked leave to make a statement, which was, of course, taken down, just as he made it, by our shorthand man. We had 3 copies typewritten, one of which I enclose. The affair proves, as I always thought it would, to be an extremely simple one, but I am obliged to you for assisting me in my investigation. With kind regards, yours very truly, G. Lestrade. The investigation really was a simple one, remarked Holmes, but I don't think it struck him in that light when he first called us in. However, let us see what Jim Browner has said for himself. This is his statement as made before Inspector Montgomery at the Shadwell police station, and it has the advantage of being verbatim. Have I anything to say? Yes, I have a deal to say. I have to make a clean breast of it all. You can hang me, or you can leave me alone. I don't care a plug which you do. I tell you, I've not shut an eye in sleep since I did it, and I don't believe I ever will again until I can get past all waking. Sometimes it's his face, but most generally it's hers. I'm never without one or the other before me. He looks frowning, but she has a kind of surprise upon her face. Aye, the white lamb. She might well be surprised when she read death on the face that had seldom looked anything but love upon her before. But it was Sarah's fault. I made the curse of a broken man put a blight on her and set the blood rotting in her veins. It's not that I want to clear myself. I know that I went back to drink, like the beast that I was. But she would have forgiven me. She would have stuck as close to me as a rope to a block if that woman had never darkened our door. For Sarah Cushing loved me. That's the root of the business. She loved me until all her love turned to poisonous hate when she knew that I thought more of my wife's footmark in the mud than I did of her whole body and soul. There were 3 sisters altogether. The one was just a good woman, the second was a devil, and the third was an angel. Sarah was 33, and Mary was 29 when I married. We were just as happy as the day was long when we set up house together, and in all Liverpool there was no better woman than my Mary. And then we asked Sarah up for a week, and the week grew into a month, and one thing led to another until she was just one of ourselves. I was blue ribbon at the time, and we were putting a little money by, and all was as bright as a new dollar. My God, whoever would have thought that it could have come to this? Who ever would have dreamed it? Exactly. One sister's an angel, one sister's a devil. And what did he... One sister was just plain? Is that what he said? I used to be home for the weekends very often, and sometimes if the ship were held back for cargo, I would have a whole week at a time. And in this way I saw a deal of my sister-in-law Sarah. She was a fine, tall woman, black and quick and fierce, with a proud way of carrying her head and a glint from her eye like a spark from a flint. But when little Mary was there I had never a thought of her, and that I swear as I hope for God's mercy. It had seemed to me sometimes that she liked to be alone with me, or to coax me out for a walk with her, but I had never thought anything of that. But one evening my eyes were opened. I had come up from the ship and found my wife out, but Sarah home. "Where's Mary?" I asked. "Oh, she has gone to pay some accounts." I was impatient and paced up and down the room. "Can't you be happy for 5 minutes without Mary, Jim?" says she. "It's a bad compliment to me that you can't be contented with my society for so short a time." "That's all right, my lass," said I, putting out my hand towards her in a kindly way. But she had it in both hers in an instant, and they burned as if they were in a fever. I looked into her eyes, and I read it all there. There was no need for her to speak, nor for me either. I frowned and drew my hand back. Then she stood by my side in silence for a bit, and then put up her hand and patted me on the shoulder. "Steady, old Jim," said she, and with a kind of mocking laugh, she ran out of the room. Well, from that time Sarah hated me with her whole heart and soul, and she is a woman who can hate too. I was a fool to let her go on biding with us, a besotted fool. But I never said a word to Mary, for I knew it would grieve her. Things went on much as before, but after a time I began to find that there was a bit of a change in Mary herself. She had always been so trusting and so innocent, but now she became odd and suspicious, wanting to know where I had been and what I had been doing, and whom my letters were from, and what I had in my pockets, and 1,000 such follies. Day by day she grew odder and more irritable, and we had ceaseless rows about nothing. I was fairly puzzled by it all. Sarah avoided me now, but she and Mary were just inseparable. I can see now how she was plotting and scheming and poisoning my wife's mind against me, but I was such a blind beetle that I could not understand it at all at the time. And I broke my blue ribbon and began to drink again. But I think I should not have done it if Mary had been the same as ever. She had some reason to be disgusted with me now, and the gap between us began to be wider and wider. And then this Alec Fairbairn chipped in, and things became 1,000 times blacker. It was to see Sarah that he came to my house first, but soon it was to see us, for he was a man with winning ways, and he made friends wherever he went. He was a dashing, swaggering chap, smart and curled, who had seen half the world and could talk of what he had seen. He was good company, I won't deny it, and he had wonderful polite ways with him for a sailor man, so that I think there must have been a time when he knew more of the poop than the forecastle. For a month he was in and out of my house, and never once did it cross my mind that harm might come of his soft, tricky ways. And then at last something made me suspect, and from that day my peace was gone forever. It was only a little thing, too. I had come into the parlor unexpected, and as I walked in at the door I saw a light of welcome on my wife's face. But as she saw who it was, it faded again, and she turned away with a look of disappointment. That was enough for me. There was no one but Alec Fairbairn, whose step she could have mistaken for mine. If I could have seen him, then I should have killed him, for I have always been like a madman when my temper gets loose. Mary saw the devil's light in my eyes, and she ran forward with her hands on my sleeves. "Don't, Jim, don't," says she. "Where's Sarah?" I asked. "In the kitchen," says she. "Sarah," says I as I went in, "this man Fairbairn is never to darken my door again." "Why not?" says she. "Because I order it." "Oh," says she. "Can we stop writing 'says she'? That's very difficult. If my friends are not good enough in this house, then I am not good enough for it either." "You can do what you like," says I, "but if Fairbairn shows his face here again, I'll send you one of his ears for a keepsake." She was frightened by my face, I think, for she never answered a word, and the same evening she left my house. Well, I don't know now whether it was pure devilry on the part of this woman, or whether she thought that she could turn me against my wife by encouraging her to misbehave. Anyway, she took a house just 2 streets off and let lodging to sailors. Fairbairn used to stay there, and Mary would go round to have tea with her sister and him. How often she went, I don't know, but I followed her one day, and as I broke in at the door, Fairbairn got away from the back garden wall, like the cowardly skunk that he was. I swore to my wife that I would kill her if I found her in his company again, and I led her back with me, sobbing and trembling and as white as a piece of paper. There was no trace of love between us any longer. I could see that she hated me and feared me, and when the thought of it drove me to drink, then she despised me as well. Well, Sarah found out that she could not make a living in Liverpool, so she went back, as I understand, to live with her sister in Croydon, and things jogged on much the same as ever at home. And then came last week, and all the misery and ruin. It was in this way we had gone on the May Day for a round voyage of 7 days, but a hogshead got loose and started one of our plates, so that we had to put back into port for 12 hours. I left the ship and came home, thinking what a surprise it would be for my wife, and hoping that maybe she would be glad to see me so soon. The thought was in my head as I turned into my own street, and at that moment a cab passed me, and there she was, sitting by the side of Fairbairn, the two chatting and laughing, with never a thought for me as I stood watching them from the footpath. I tell you, and I give you my word for it, that from that moment I was not my own master, and it is all like a dim dream when I look back on it. I had been drinking hard of late, and the two things together fairly turned my brain. There's something throbbing in my head now, like a doctor's hammer. Like a doctor's hammer, not a doctor's hammer. I do not want to go to the doctor if he's using a hammer. That's terrifying. But that morning I seemed to have all of Niagara whizzing and buzzing in my ears. Well, I took to my heels and I ran after the cab. I had a heavy oak stick in my hand, and I tell you I saw red from the first. But as I ran I got cunning, too, and hung back a little to see them without being seen. They pulled up soon at the railway station. There was a good crowd round the booking office, so I got quite close to them without being seen. They took tickets for New Brighton. So did I, but I got in 3 carriages behind them. When we reached it, they walked along the parade, and I was never more than 100 yards from them. At last I saw them hire a boat and start for a row, for it was a very hot day, and they thought, no doubt, that it would be cooler on the water. It was just as if they had been given into my hands. There was a bit of a haze, and you could not see more than a few 100 yards. I hired a boat for myself, and I pulled after them. I could see the blur of their craft, but they were going nearly as fast as I, and they must have been a long mile from the shore before I caught them. The haze was like a curtain all round us, and there were we 3 in the middle of it. My God, shall I ever forget their faces when they saw who was in the boat that was closing in upon them? She screamed out. He swore like a madman and jabbed at me with an oar, for he must have seen death in my eyes. I got past it, and got on, and got one in with my stick that crushed his head like an egg. I would have spared her, perhaps, for all my madness, but she threw her arms round him, crying out to him and calling him Alec. I struck again, and she lay stretched beside him. I was like a wild beast then that had tasted blood. If Sarah had been there, by the Lord, she would have joined them. I pulled out my knife and... Well, there. I've said enough. I gave me a kind of savage joy when I thought how Sarah would feel when she had such signs as these of what her meddling had brought about. Then I tied the bodies into the boat, stove a plank, and stood up until they had sunk. I knew very well that the owner would think that they had lost their bearings in the haze and had drifted off out to sea. I cleaned myself up, got back to land, and joined my ship without a soul having a suspicion of what had passed. That night I made up the packet for Sarah Cushing, and next day I sent it from Belfast. There you have the whole truth. You can hang me or do what you like with me, but you cannot punish me as I have been punished already. I cannot shut my eyes, but I see those 2 faces staring at me as they stared when my boat broke through the haze. I killed them quick, but they are killing me slow. And if I have another night of it, I shall be either mad or dead before morning. You won't put me alone into a cell, sir. For pity's sake, don't, and may you be treated in your day of agony as you treat me now. What is the meaning of it, Watson? Asked Holmes solemnly, as he laid down the paper. What object is served by this circle of misery and violence and fear? It must tend to some end, or else our universe is ruled by chance, which is unthinkable. But what end? There is the greatest standing perennial problem in which human reason is as far from an answer as ever. And that is the end of The Adventure of the Cardboard Box. And that's going to be where we end today. We absolutely do not have time for another one. Let's see. The Adventures of the Red Circle is what's next. That sounds familiar. I feel like I'm supposed to know that one. But I don't. So that's cool. I'm excited to read that. I'm flipping ahead to see what stories we got here. Cool. It'll be good. So yeah, that's gonna be it for tonight. I enjoyed that one. I liked it. And again, I just really like that we're getting all of this from Watson's perspective. I enjoy that. I think if it was told from any other, well, I think if it was told from like an omniscient perspective or from Holmes's perspective, it wouldn't seem that Holmes would be as amazing, if that makes sense. Like, Watson is somebody who is still like piecing things together. Like, he doesn't have that high level deductive skills that Holmes has, and neither do we. So I think that's pretty cool that we are finding things out at the same time that Watson is, and I like that Watson is still asked for input, even if it's not complete or is different or what, or it's maybe like what Holmes first thought, but then he had this thought. I think that's kind of nice, because I feel like Watson is us and we are Watson. And that, like, oh yeah, that's totally what happened. Watson's right. And then it's like, let me tell you all the ways that you have missed things. So that's kind of cool. I enjoy it. I enjoy it. So yes, we will continue next week with this as well. More Sherlock Holmes before the spoopy. So yeah. Thank you all for joining me. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate your support. And I 1000% appreciate you. I hope you all have a great night. If I do not see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Bye.